Welcome, 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 welcome. It's early in the morning here. Not that early, but and it's late where you are. We have a very special guest from across the pond, I believe is the expression, uh, Dr. Grant Blank. This is part of our continuing series where we talk to professors, reporters, writers, artists, columnists, activists, anybody on the left, anybody on the right, anybody who's aware of political polarization in America and the impacts that it could have. Trying to bring the experts to you. We don't care what the perspective is. We just want to bring thoughtful people directly to you. So you could do this thing that was popular back when I was in high school called Thinking for Yourself. Maybe it'll be popular again in the future. Who knows? Again, with us today is Dr. Grant Blank. He's the department lecturer at the Oxford Internet Institute. That is at the world famous University of Oxford. And he has a lot of accolades. He's a survey research fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute. He's a sociologist who studies the social and cultural impact of the internet and other new communication media. He is also interested in cultural sociology, especially reviews and cultural evaluation. Some of his expertise is in social and cultural influence of the internet, the Oxford Internet Survey, cultural and social change, public opinion polls, popular culture, research methods, and statistics. Some of the work that he's already published is The Echo Chambers Overstated, the moderating effect of political interest and diverse media, dimensions of internet use, amount, variety, and types, emergence of next generation internet users. His survey research fellow until August 2020. He received the William F. Ogburn Career Achievement Award for the Communication, Information Technology, and Media Sociology section of the American Sociological Association in 2015. Very prestigious. This award recognizes a sustained body of research that has made an outstanding contribution to the advancement of knowledge in the area of sociology. He was also awarded a Teaching Excellence Award from the University of Oxford in 2015. He's been awarded a visiting fellowship to the Center for Advanced Internet Studies at the Ruhr University in Bochum, Germany for 2 months, working on cross-national study of echo chambers in 6 European countries and the United States. He's also a sociologist who studies the social and cultural impact of the internet and new media. He's also interested in cultural sociology, especially reviews and cultural evaluation. He began his career as an independent consultant based in Chicago, Illinois, specializing in research design, statistical analysis, and database design. He previously taught at American University, very prestigious, in Washington, D.C. He completed a PhD in sociology at the University of Chicago in 1999 and joined the OII in 2010. And this is the article that I found the professor. But before we get into that, Professor, did I get anything wrong? Is there something we need to correct?
No, I think that's all very well stated. That's fine.
Okay, great. Um, so thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. This article, what is this? The echo chambers overstated the moderating effects of political interest and diverse media. And this was published, I think, in 2018. If you could, Professor, if you could imagine somebody's been in a cave for 10 years and start off there, they don't have basic information. Why was this an important issue in 2018? Why was this worth talking about? What's going on in the world at that time? Why is this a worthwhile topic of study or something that people should be concerned about?
Excellent question. Yeah, the issue here is the underlying issue is political polarization and the suspicion, and there were been a number of articles on this as well as several books, that one of the factors contributing to polarization was people in an echo chamber. An echo chamber meaning that they heard all the same opinions, they got the same facts, and everything supported their political perspective. Since it supported their political perspective and that's all they saw, anyone who believed something different actually had to be completely wrong, because they weren't reading the evidence that was blatantly in front of everyone's eyes. So that then led to the question about, is this related to the political polarization in the US, about revolving around the Trump, Hillary Clinton, and now Trump and Biden, and some of the hostility that has generated in the US as well.
So I'm guessing by the phrase overstated that perhaps the experts are wrong. I'm over here in America, and all we hear is all of the experts saying social media, the algorithms are designed to make people upset, so they spend more time on the application. And if you're arguing with somebody, you're spending a lot more time on the application, and then they can sell more chocolate bars or whatever they advertise for, as Mark Zuckerberg said at the U.S. Senate. But is that true? Is it true that if social media is doing this, and one of the things that bothers me is that there seems to be this idea in America that, well, if you could just get rid of social media, poof, everything will go right back to normal and we'll be all fixed. And I'm like, that seems fantastical. That seems too simple. What say you, Professor? We get rid of social media. We build a giant time machine we can fit all of America in, and we go back before 2015. We have no social media. Everything's fine in America. No problems here.
Let me answer your question this way, that it is probably true that if you look at certain social media, that people only talk to each other. Twitter is the poster child for this, and have been a number of studies that have looked at Twitter both in the US and in Britain, where they show that Republicans and Democrats have largely distinct social networks on Twitter. They're not overlapping. The same thing's true in Britain, the Conservative Party members and Labour Party members. So social media does, at least certain social media, and Twitter is the poster child for this. Other social media have not been studied in anywhere near that sort of depth. Certain social media seems to contribute to this echo chamber effect and hence to political polarization. The flaw in that argument, well, let me add one more point before I talk about the flaw. The other point is, you're absolutely correct in the point that you raised there, that in fact there is ample testimony that in fact Facebook and Twitter algorithms are designed to show people similar things and to actually foster a negative view of anyone who opposes them. So in that sense, they are designed to produce controversy and polarization. Now, the problem with that point of view is that people get political information from many, many sources, not just social media. While social media are an important part, it turns out that television is probably more important as a source for political news. People also get news from from print media, from websites of print media, from their podcasts that they might listen to during their commute to work. There's a whole range of media, in other words. And if you look at that entire range of media, you do not see the kind of polarization that you see on social media. In fact, people say they encounter diverse points of view. They actually agree that they have changed their mind as a result of something that they have read, changed their mind about a political issue based on things that they have encountered in their work with media. So that's the clue there, that's what we found, is the word you pointed to right at the beginning of your question, which is overstated. That the echo chamber is overstated. It does, there are echo chamber effects in certain media, but you don't see them if you look at the entire ecosystem of media in general.
So it's inaccurate to say I'm a hardcore Trump supporter, I'm a hardcore Biden supporter. All my political knowledge comes just from Twitter.
Right.
In reality, I probably watch some TV, I probably listen to some radio, I probably talk to a couple neighbors. And so while social media might be an echo chamber, it's not my only source of information.
Right. That's correct. And social media, if you ask people, do they trust media? And you ask them the extent to which they trust different media, and you give them a list of media and ask them to rank all of these media, social media is always at the bottom as the least trustworthy. The one that, and so, I mean, exposure is not the same as being convinced. Particularly if it's a particular medium, a particular source that you don't trust. So that's why we're arguing that social media are not terribly important in this issue of in the question of echo chambers and polarization.
Okay, then let's get to the follow-up question, if I may.
Absolutely.
If social media is not the main source, why are we so polarized in America?
Oh, I think there are a number of reasons for that, but I think the broad question of why we're so polarized is actually a very open question. Um, I like very much Kathy Kramer's work at the University of Wisconsin. She has gone into rural areas in Wisconsin and talked to people about their concerns about politics. And what she finds is that that in many of the rural areas, the highest paid person in the community in these small rural towns are the people who teach school, because they are paid on urban wage scales. They're not paid on the scales that are adjusted for the cost of living in the smaller rural communities. And they are often also the only people who have health insurance, because again, that's the sort of thing that comes along with being a teacher in an urban area. That isn't something that comes along with being a shop owner or a shop clerk or a farmer in a rural area. So they're very resentful of what they see as a bias toward urban areas. They feel very much like rural areas are being ignored and that they are being ignored. Um, and I think it actually probably goes even deeper than that. It goes to the extent that people say, you know, and there's a quote on this, I think, from the Washington Post. That is Kathy Kramer. Yes, that's her website. Um, the Very good. You found that very quickly, by the way. I'm impressed.
We try.
Uh-huh. The that There's a quote on this from the Washington Post following the 2016 election, when the Post sent reporters out to various rural areas and asked, "Why did you vote for Donald Trump?" And one of the best quotes that I heard about that was, "I voted for Barack Obama, and he called me a racist." Um, and this was from some I think that's probably not that personalized, that Barack Obama called a person like that a racist, but a number of liberals said, oh, all white people are racist. And these are people who say, I'm not, and I don't want to be labeled. I don't think it's accurate to label me that way, and they feel very resentful. And the result of this is a sense of polarization of a large group of people who feel that they're being ignored, and they don't like it.
That makes a lot of sense. I believe I've heard of this concept. Let me just put this down here if I can. The Politics of Resentment by Catherine J. Kramer.
That's the book. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was the book that set it off.
It precedes Donald Trump, by the way, I should note, because it deals with Scott Walker, who was the conservative Republican governor of Wisconsin at the time.
The book came before Trump.
I believe that's true. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Hope so, since I just asserted it.
Well, it's around that time, definitely. I
Hmm.
think that sounds right. Scott Walker came before, and so
Hmm.
this is I had heard about this book. I need to get this one. Politics of Resentment, and so basically, she was saying that they kind of resent the urban elitist coastal liberal because they feel that person looks down on them.
Right. Hmm.
I believe during Obama's presidency, he mentioned that he struggled to understand the gods, guns, and gays crowd. And there was a lot, as he put it, or as other people put it, and there was many political historians who kind of pointed that out after his presidency was over, that he really struggled with that group because
Hmm.
they didn't want to seem to have anything to do with him, and he couldn't understand that. Most people responded very positively. He was at least competent, even if you didn't like his policies. They were at least somewhat centrist and somewhat competent. And here was a group that um, just didn't like him. I remember after he was president, he watched Fox News for 2 or 3 days straight,
Hmm.
just trying to understand. And he said, if all I saw was Fox News, I would hate me too. He said that.
Yes. Hmm.
So, um, if the politics of resentment came before Donald Trump, then did Trump break America, or did we already have problems before he got here?
Oh, I think we already had problems before he got there, before he became politically, nationally prominent. Um, these resentments go back some ways, I suspect. Trump is a very was able to articulate them in an effective way that no other politician had been able to do. Um, and his articulation is a very unique combination of what he is. Um, I mean, he's a former liberal Democrat who supported abortion for many years,
Right,
and yet
right.
now he's, seen as a darling of very hardcore conservatives. Um, and he has a very checkered reputation personally. His character is certainly not what anyone would regard as very um, strongly ethical or moral. Yet he is supported by large numbers of evangelical Christians. Um, he's a unique figure in many respects, and has been able to channel a lot of this resentment, I think is the right word, um, in ways that nobody else has been able to duplicate, even after we've had 6 or 7 years of him in the national spotlight.
I had heard that, and I was just talking to someone else about this. I remember the day that Trump was running for office and the news started picking up on him. I was reading newspaper articles, and the news was talking about how it was so bizarre. Trump would fly in to someplace in the middle of America, a rural area like Wisconsin, very rural, single family homes, mostly farms, no big cities. And he'd fly in on this fancy helicopter and come out in his $1 million suit. And all of the farmers and the other rural people would run up to him, and they'd hug him, and they liked him. And the
Mhm.
reporters were sitting there going, "Hold on now. You're a rural farmer type person. This guy is clearly a city slicker,
Mhm.
clearly coming in his city slicker helicopter, and you guys are hugging him like he's your long lost brother. What is going on here? This makes no sense to us at all. City slicker, rural, urban." And what they didn't get was, yeah, the people in the rural area got that, but they felt that Trump actually spoke to them and saw them and was on their side against the other city slickers. And it
Right.
took the media 1 or 2 years to pick up on that. They just
Mhm.
didn't get it for like a couple of years. And I think that's what helped create the problem with Trump. They couldn't understand, you don't look like a rural person. Why are they talking to you? But when you add in this
Mhm.
politics of resentment, yeah, he doesn't look like them, but he's definitely not like one of you liberal left coasters, and that's
Mhm.
all they care about. Is that accurate? Is that wildly off?
No, I think that's very accurate. I think Trump was very difficult to understand. He did not fit the stereotypes of the political system. He was odd version of conservatism. He was a former liberal. Um, as you say, he was very wealthy. He inherited, if I remember, $30 million from his father, and used this to build a real estate empire in New York, of all places, home of liberalism, perhaps next to San Francisco only. So it was a very, very odd combination, and it took media and I think the political system years to figure out. It wasn't really until after he had been president for some time that people figured out, the media started to get a handle on how to deal with him. I mean, the way he makes things up was just completely unprecedented, I think, in American history. Most politicians, when they're caught with saying something false, they will contritely stop saying it. But he didn't. He doubled down, and in fact, he openly lied. And this was something that media couldn't handle very well, and it took years to figure out an appropriate approach. So he was certainly a very unusual figure in American politics.
Yeah, I want to focus what I'm saying here. So the story over here, and I'm in California, which is the most hardcore left of all of America, and people freaked out when Trump was elected. I was in the Capitol in Sacramento the day after he was elected. I went there the night of the election, and I woke up the morning there, and we went down to Capitol Park. And if you pull it up on Google, you can look up the Capitol Park in Sacramento in California. It's quite big. It's a very large lot built in the 1800s. The entire lawn was covered with people, just covered with people, and they were just doing this, like just it was a super bizarre scene. The entire lawn was covered with weeping people, just crying their hearts out, looking like they had no idea what was going on. The streets were literally full of protest marchers. You couldn't drive a car. They had 200 or 300 cops out there, and all the cops had their hand on the gun like this because they were like, "What the hell's going on?" All these people came out of nowhere. It was surreal. This place did not handle it well at all. But one of the things that always bothered me was that people said, "Well, we lived in a perfect state of nature. Everything was fine. And then Trump broke it all by himself. And if just he didn't come here, we'd be fine. And if we could just lock him up in prison or make him go away or make him not be able to run for office, then all of his wicked, nasty, bad ideas will just go away. Poof! They'll just disappear." And I'm like, one of the things that always grabbed me was, I remember when Obama was president. And one of the things that grabbed me, because I'm multiracial, I'm half Mexican, half white, and a little bit of Choctaw indigenous. So it's an important issue for me. There was a Miss America pageant, I think, in 2010 and one in 2012, both when Obama was president. The first one, both of these are American girls. Either they were born here or they came over here when they were 1 or 2. So the first one was a girl whose parents were from Lebanon in 22. The second one was a girl whose parents were from India in 2012. Maybe mom and dad were Lebanese or Indian, but these are American girls. They talk like American girls. They dress like American girls. They act like American girls. They're American girls. Very pretty girls. Not getting into it. But so when they elected the girl whose parents were from Lebanon, oh my God, the news here had to have national stories about the backlash. There were so many people on social media saying that person needs to put a cloth on their head and go back to the Middle East, with a lot of cursing, and why the hell we got a Muslim and we don't, she don't represent us. And there was so much backlash across all social media and all internet channels, and even like Yahoo Internet News, where people posted comments of people just rejecting her. And it was national news. 2 years later, happened again.
Hmm.
Who's this Indian girl? She's not American. Trump didn't make that happen. Nobody was even talking about Trump being a candidate at all. Trump might have been still technically a Democrat if you consider it at that time. Um, so when I hear Trump made us all racist, I'm like, what about these two things that were so horrible? The national news had to stop what they're doing and go, damn, people really didn't react well to a brown girl being Miss America. Whoops, 2 years later, same thing. And this is the Obama, we're post-racial society all coming together. And I go, explain that to me. Explain how America did that so much that the national media had to stop, and yet Trump made us all racist.
Hmm.
It,
Right. Hmm. No,
was there racism before Trump?
you're absolutely right that these issues have been building for many years. Um, they're building out of a set of issues that I don't think have been fully explained very well. As I said, I like Kathy Kramer's approach very much, but I don't think it's everything. I think there's much more going on. Um, One part of it, I suspect, is that the world is changing for a lot of people, and they don't necessarily like those changes. For example, large numbers of people speaking Spanish in all sorts of American cities, or speaking English with a Spanish accent. This is not in recent times the sort of thing we've heard. It would have been very common in 1920 in northeastern cities because there'd been this enormous wave of immigration from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. So not speaking English wouldn't have been an unusual thing, but that's a century ago almost. And so no one in living memory would remember that. So you have a bunch of racial issues that are coming out just because the country is changing and people don't know how to respond to it. Donald Trump gives them a voice, and people attach, race to this issue. I'm not convinced personally that race is the most important issue. It is certainly part of the mix. Um, I think there's a class issue here that is very important. These tend to be people who have less income and have less education. Um, and so there's a big class issue. Um, that's hard for Americans to talk about, I think. Um, it's hard to identify people who in different classes. People code themselves by race much more easily. Since you can just look at skin, you can just by observation look at their skin color. Um, so that makes it easier to talk about. Um, but Donald Trump is only a voice. And in 10 or 20 years, he'll look weird. People will wonder, how could you have this strange aberration? Um, and what does this mean? How could we ever have done these things or thought about them? Uh, I mean, that's a prediction. It's not a good
Sure,
social science prediction, I'm afraid,
sure,
but
sure.
it's a guess. I mean, we can see this in other political settings where people become prominent and then 20 years later they're irrelevant because the world has moved on from them.
Sure,
Um, I
sure.
Let me just add one point here, and this was an article in today's Washington Post, a fascinating article about how Americans were now living in mixed race neighborhoods. Most Americans, more than 50%, were living in mixed race neighborhoods, um, even among white people. This was true. And that this was a dramatic change from 30 years ago. They were tracing census data from the 1990 census through 2000, 2010, and 2020, where the proportion of Americans living in mixed race neighborhoods has been rising very quickly, and the proportion of living in neighborhoods of a single race is declining. And this is happening all over the country. So, in many respects, I think the point from that is we are becoming more diverse in the US in many ways, but we're also, and many of these ways are a bit subtle and are not necessarily comfortable for everyone, but but they're continuing. Those trends have not stopped just because Trump was elected. or because Trump gave voice to these, to some of the resentments that people have felt.
I hear you. More than 50% of Americans live in mixed race neighborhoods. One of the issues that we've been seeing is that we had George W. Bush and we had Donald Trump, and they were both elected, although they lost the popular vote. So they did not have a majority of Americans backing them, but because of our weird system here, they got into power. One of the things that grabs me is that this is a quote from, I don't know if you can read it. I'll read it for you, but this is from a man called Norman Ornstein. He works in demographics. He's very well respected. He works at the American Enterprise Institute. He wrote a book with Thomas Mann called It's Even Worse Than We Think from Before. Anyway, and the thing was is that he wrote this, It's Even Worse Than We Think It Was, 10 years ago, before anyone ever heard of Trump. So he was going, things are breaking down. People hadn't even heard of Trump. Point was is that they're talking about, okay, well, who's electing Bush and who's electing Trump? And I said, well, there's about 35, 40 states in the interior of America where they have less population than the coast. As Hillary Clinton said when she ran against Trump, I want all the coastal regions. I want all the cities. I want all the urban areas. Great. That still leaves out 80% of the landmass of America. And that landmass is in the interior. And it's primarily rural. It's primarily not diverse. It's primarily kind of one thing. And here's what Norman Ornstein is saying. I want to repeat a statistic I use in every talk. By the year 2040 or so, 70% of Americans will live in 15 states, meaning 30% of Americans will choose 70 senators, and 30% will be older, whiter, more rural, and more male than the 70%. Unsettling, to say the least. He's basing that on the U.S. Census. His analysis has been corroborated by people on the left and people on the right. What he's pointing out is that, okay, more than 50% of Americans live in mixed-race neighborhoods, mostly on the coast and in major urban areas, and mostly in the interior of America. They're still mostly exclusively white with no LGBTQ, no youth, no minorities, no immigrants, no liberal media, all watching Fox News. So basically all the kids leave, no immigrants move in, minorities leave too. You just have an old, elderly white population that really hasn't, not very educated, hasn't really gone to the city very much. All they know is the rural lifestyle. And they control 30 or 40 states, which means, okay, half the country's living in mixed race neighborhoods. They'll still lose the elections in the future. They'll still lose 2/3 of the Senate. In fact, he's saying it doesn't actually get better until the year 2045, when the U.S. Census has said we'll have a majority minority voter nation. A lot of people get it confused and they go, well, America's a majority minority nation with babies. Babies can't vote. Babies don't get a vote till 2045. So even though we have a bunch of minority babies, they're not voters until 2045, around the time that NASA has said there'll be a fully functional colony on Mars. So I ask people, yeah, I'm mixed raced. I love it. Is that where America's going? Is that where all of America's going? Because the census is saying you're going to have 30, 40 states in the interior who didn't follow the trend the rest of you did. And they basically run the federal government.
I mean, Norman Ornstein's a very good political scientist. I have never met him personally, but I've read some of his papers. And I suspect, I mean, he's certainly correct in that statement that you've highlighted there. I think there is he is, what should I say? He's making the best case for himself there. That's true that will be the way the Senate would be composed. Although one can debate the margins of the prediction and so on, but nonetheless, leave that alone.
Sure.
Of course, the House of Representatives will be quite different, and that will be decided by population, not by 2 senators per state. Furthermore, the Electoral College is based on both the number of senators as well as the number of representatives. So California will still exert a disproportionate role in the Electoral College just due to its very large population. So those are issues, I think, on the other side of that point. But there is this issue in the way the Senate is composed. There are historical reasons for designing the Senate that way. The last major revision of the Senate was to allow it to be elected by senators to be elected by popular vote now about a century ago, rather than being appointed by governors or state legislatures. Um, um, I personally think that this is not a particularly, while I agree with his last sentence there, that it is unsettling to think about this, I think it's not as bad as he thinks about it, as he thinks it is. The urban areas, Chicago is, of course, a jobs magnet, and it has continued to draw enormous populations into it. It's growing very quickly. Similarly, there are other big cities that in the Midwest and in the South that have grown quickly. Texas, for example, is certainly an example of that, and it's not going to be older and whiter. So I think there's a reason to be concerned about that, but I'm not terribly concerned about it.
Because there's still large cities in red states, and the
They're
large.
large, yes, and red states themselves are, weird. I mean, look at Kansas. It voted down decisively an attempt to amend the Constitution to prohibit abortion. And this, for all you can say about who is for and against abortion in the US, certainly there's a great deal more nuance than you sometimes see in the news media.
Fair enough. Fair enough. One of the things, though, is that we had a Congress member, Marjorie Taylor Greene, on President's Day come out and say, red and blue can't get along with each other. We need to have a national voice. And there was a lot of ridicule of her and a lot of people laughing. And there was a lot of people saying, "Oh, Marjorie, you idiot, your state of Georgia is blue." And actually, that was all wrong. As you're getting at, the urban cities are blue, but the entire rest of the state is hardcore red. Same thing with Texas. I have half my Mexican family comes from Texas. I hear about Texas turning purple all the time. Beto O'Rourke, and I looked at the maps. That's sort of true, but not the way they're representing it. The cities are turning hardcore blue. The entire rest of Texas is still hardcore red and has made no change at all. And we actually have people like Myrna Flores, who was elected in Texas as a conservative Republican. And she was the one who Nancy Pelosi pushed her Mexican daughter out of the way in the photograph.
Okay.
Yeah, that's considered racism in the Central Valley. We won't get into it. Apparently nobody in the left wanted to call Nancy Pelosi out for that, although I've lived here and I know exactly what it looks like. But the question is what if we have urban blue cities, but it never gets better for the next 20 years, in that we never really have purple states? We get hardcore red rural areas and hardcore blue cities, and we start to just wipe out any purplish. Will we be better in the future? Going, so Illinois, all your votes went to the liberal. Come on, guys, let's celebrate. Okay, 90% of the counties, Phil, you just completely ignored everything we had to say.
Right.
We're talking about the politics of resentment in Wisconsin. We're talking about how truckers in Oregon or Washington, I believe, shut the state down because they're mostly conservative and the governor's super left, and she was forcing some climate change laws on them that they didn't like. And so they responded by clogging up the 5 freeway and shutting the economy down for a month. How do we know we're not going into a future of this? Hey, my city has more power than you, so I'm just going to ram my policies down your throat, and I expect you to just be cool with it, sit down and shut up. What if they don't? What if they revolt like in Oregon? What if they say let's split off and secede, like in Georgia. I understand Marjorie Taylor Greene just said that and it didn't happen, but kind of destabilizing for the economy and the political scene of Georgia to have one of your major representatives say that. I certainly wouldn't call these situations stable. How do we know that these kind of low intensity pulling aparts don't continue far into the future?
We don't really. I mean, I think that's the only honest answer. You know, the political theory, I'm not a political scientist, I'm a sociologist, as you pointed out in my bio. But I don't know of political theory that gives you a good way to predict the future, certainly 2040. You know, that's a long way away,
Sure.
17 years now, and lots of things could happen.
Sure.
That could change things a great deal. So, I mean, I think in one sense, yeah, there's a big issue here. The rural areas in the US have continued to lose population, and that's probably not going to change over the next decades. So cities are going to continue to grow. What exactly that's going to mean? You know, there are always minorities everywhere. I mean, if you want to talk about a minority, you'd be a Republican in Chicago,
Right.
for example, you know, run by Democrats for now close to a century, closing in.
Yeah.
And there's no real likelihood of that ever change, that changing in the foreseeable future. So it's a question about what do you want to believe here as the future? I tend to think that the institutions are more stable than that and they're stronger than that they'll be able to handle that sort of issue. Whether I'm right or not is anybody's guess. Um, you could make, you know, this sort of mob action on January 6th was certainly a very serious counter argument to what I just said. Um, yeah, colleges, yes, I think that's this is a college issue as well, although universities really, colleges tend to be very liberal. This is one of their weaknesses, is they don't really have a lot of political diversity while they're trying to improve diversity among underrepresented minorities. Um, and that's a that's a serious problem, I think. Um, you know, the education for as long as I remember the research, at least back to the 1950s and probably much longer, has always tended to produce more liberal people.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
it gives people a broader perspective, you know, for whatever. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons people have proposed for this. Um, you know, I think the college issue is, yeah, it's the problem there is, as I said, just lack of political diversity. And it is a serious problem because, you know, students are supposed to encounter uncomfortable ideas and be taught to think. And if you don't encounter political ideas that you haven't thought of before, um, you know, that's an echo chamber, to bring us back to the beginning of our conversation. And parts of universities do form an echo chamber, I think. I mean,
Yes.
having lived in universities for most of my career.
Yeah, it's become an issue. I'm in California where we love shouting down conservative speakers and forcing them off the campus. I mean, that's what
Yeah.
we're about here.
Hmm.
If we didn't invent it, we certainly popularized it big time. Um, my I want to go back to the institutions questions in a second, but I did want to ask you. This was a setup for the next question I was going to ask you. One of the major debates that we've had about political polarization is what exactly causes it, you know, social media or this or that. That's fair. That's an open question. But another one that's out there that I just think is really destabilizing is, you know, it's just the elites that are polarized. The actual American people aren't polarized at all. I'd like to show you a few slides and then ask you for a response, if I may.
Sure.
Um, this is talking about how children are now sorting themselves into red and blue colleges. That before they go into college, they're coming out of high school, they're saying, I don't want to go to that blue school. I don't want to go to that red university. That's high school students making that decision,
Hmm.
parents. Then we can also talk about people don't want to marry people who are outside of their political party. This is from the Atlantic, a very respectable policy journal. 2/3 of liberal and conservatives would likely swipe left. Then we also have an article from Time Magazine, and it went from about 1/3 of people in 2012 won't date someone outside their political party to over half by 2020, meaning a majority of Americans won't date each other. 2/3 won't marry each other. Schools are already being segregated by politics. None of this is the elites. I can't remember a speech from Donald Trump where he said, "Don't date any liberal. Don't marry any liberal. Go to separate schools." I can't remember him or Josh Hawley or Sarah Palin or anyone saying anything like that. So my question to you is it just the elites that are polarized, or is it fair to say the people themselves in America are polarized?
It's certainly true that the elites are polarized. That's certainly a major reason why people are polarized, because a lot of people take their political opinions from whoever they respect among the elites.
Okay.
I mean, there's a formal theory of this called something like elite opinion formation. I think some name like that. That is a pretty much bread and butter political science, I think. So certainly elites are polarized, and that contributes to everyone else being polarized as well. Um, I don't. I'm not familiar with the data on what people think. I mean, your examples here are good ones, and they certainly suggest a degree of polarization among the population in general. Um, my and certainly, and do remember some data suggesting the same sort of thing broadly, but it's not an area that I know real well.
Sure.
My sense is there certainly has been polarization among people that is greater than we would have seen 20 years ago. Um, Now, the polarization, how that shakes itself out is a complex mix. Partly the two political parties have become more separate. I mean, there's no version of conservative Democrats or liberal Republicans anymore. So, Democrats have been wiped out in the South, and Republicans pretty much wiped out in the Northeast. So, the parties themselves are are less complicated in that political sense than they used to be, and that reflects in part some popular polarization as well.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
so I was speaking to those issues without ever coming down on one side or the other, I'm afraid.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Let me ask you a sociology question, though. I've heard about this
Sure.
elite opinion formation. The people take their cues from the elites and then they act it out. Couple things. Donald Trump did not make America racist. He was
No.
responding to racism that was already there. Many analysts have said that he was recognizing something that was already there. He was toying around with the Tea Party during the presidency of Barack Obama and talking about how Obama wasn't a real American. So he
Hmm.
was already toying around with racism and discrimination and xenophobia in 2015. And a lot of political historians are saying that was him experimenting. That was him figuring out what message was going to work so that he could blast on the scene in 2016. If that's true, that would seem to be an example of the elites taking a cue from the public.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I think that happens as well. I mean, it certainly is not true that the only way that this is all one way. Um, and people, you know, Trump was exploiting an opinion that existed already. I think the counterexample would be his all of his statements about election fraud. I mean, I don't think
Sure.
anyone, if he had simply said, I lost, I did my best, we'll come back and in 4 years I'm going to win. Um, then I don't think anyone else would have raised the issue of election fraud. This is an issue. This is an issue. This is an example of an issue that was generated solely from an elite point of view. So I think it works both ways, and I think it depends on the issue.
I could see that. I will point out, though, that many conservatives, but that even goes back to Trump. A lot of conservatives bought the whole there's no collusion with Russia. The Democrats are making it up, which turned out to be true, but we didn't know that for years. And so there was already kind of a, they're making things up against him before he went to the big lie. So I would say there was some of the seeding of the ground before he was able to go, let's go for the big lie. But a lot of the seeding of the ground was by Trump himself. They're lying against me. It's all fake news. Don't buy it. They're all fraudsters, etc. Unfortunately, some of the things he said turned out to be true, but okay.
Yeah.
My other question is this one. So it does go both ways. The elites can take cues from the people. The people can take cues from the elites. I wanted to ask you about this statement. I think the institutions will hold the center. I've talked to a couple political historians, and they'll say, Mark, America was more politically divided in the past. We had the 1960s, the famous 60s radicalism of America, and people were way more violent then than they are now. I mean, they were shooting judges and civil rights activists. They killed a president, another presidential candidate, the Kennedy brothers. So way worse than anything we have now by violence. Okay. But here's the other thing those same people will say. The difference between then and now, and why it might be more dangerous now than in the 1960s, even though it's less violent, is that in the 1960s, people believed in Congress. They believed in the president. They would follow the laws of the Supreme Court. Now we exist in a society where one party will say, I'm going to deny your guy won the election for 4 years. And then the other party will go, oh, yeah, well, I'm going to deny your guy won the election for 40 years. And then we have Congress with the lowest support or approval rating, I think, in 40 to 70 years. It's super low. One of my favorite points that people didn't want to bring up was even as hated as Donald Trump was, Nancy Pelosi was hated more. You won't hear that in the news. But when you actually look at like national opinion polls, so Congress was not well liked. People were scared of Trump, but they were not big fans of Congress. Loss of faith there. Loss of faith in the presidential elections and being valid, people questioning that. Then we had Roe v. Wade overturned. Now you have elected officials, high elected officials like the Lieutenant Governor of California, the second highest ranking politician in the world's fifth largest economy. Second ranking politician, world's fifth largest economy, who says, quote, I will defy the Supreme Court. I don't follow your court. I don't follow your law. That sort of language last seen in 1860, right before things got a little bit, what do they call that word? Kinetic. How is this? It would seem to suggest in the 1960s, people at least had a shared belief in institutions, and we don't have that today. So would you agree that might make us more dangerous today than in the 1960s, although the 60s were technically more violent than anything we've seen so far?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wish there was a very good sociological answer to that question. I would, broadly speaking, I think I would agree with the way you phrased that question right at the end there, that the lack of faith in institutions is an important concern, and it may in fact contribute to a breakdown of institutions. Now, the question is, how important is this? I mean, what are the important issues that you want to pay attention to when you're asking, will the institutions hold on? Will they continue to produce, outcomes that people like? And there's no good theory of that I'm aware of. Perhaps I'm showing the limits of my knowledge here. You might have someone else who would know more than I do. I
No.
guess what I would think here is that the important things are things like the things that the federal government does that everyone likes. Sending out Social Security checks every single month. Providing military defense. The cultural issues that people fight over, that people are polarized on, tend not to be as important, I think, as those issues. And I'm thinking the sort of bread and butter issues for many people will be more important. Now, that's a particular value judgment about the way people in general weight the issues of jobs and the economy versus cultural issues of attitudes and points of view. I am a bit of a Marxist here in a belief that the economy is more fundamental, that other issues are less exciting, they will certainly, a group of people, certainly some subset of the population will get very irritated at abortion, but with an unemployment rate of less than 4% right now, is that really something people are going to seriously worry about? Large numbers of people. If the unemployment rate were 10%, then I think we'd have a much more serious problem. Similarly, if the Federal Reserve can bring the inflation rate down quickly, I think that will contribute to political stability more than almost anything else. I tend to think the economic institutions are more central, that the cultural sort of issues that many people fight over are less important. That's a very good quote. Living in Britain here, as I have for the last 14 years, I really like the National Health Service. At some point I'll come back to the US and I'll have to go back to paid health care and the messy, irritatingly, bizarrely complicated American system. And I hate it. But I think healthcare is a big issue. And the fact that, I've got a whole bunch of cousins who live on farms who the only reason they have healthcare is because of Obamacare. That tempers a lot of their attitudes toward the cultural issues. Now, gay rights is a whole other issue. This is here. I tend to like a person who who normally not pay any much attention to, Andrew Sullivan, who
Right.
talks about gay marriage is a really good idea, but the whole gay rights movement has pushed onto a vast array of other issues where there's not a lot of political support for them. The whole gender fluidity and things like that, and non-binary gender, this is a very small group of people. I look at the data on this. They're real people. I don't have any problem with that, but it's just a very small group of people attracting a very large amount of attention. And I don't think it's as important as your quote says, the economy or healthcare.
I was pointing out there's a Professor Morris Fiorina, and he's largely said the same thing. That when you look at public opinion surveys, Americans are more interested in like 79% of them are concerned about the economy or healthcare. And when you ask them about gay rights or abortion, it's only like 30%. And so he takes that to mean we're not polarized, because on these cultural issues, there's a small percentage of Americans who in national surveys say they actually care. And there's a dominant proportion of Americans on national surveys who come together and say things like, school shootings are bad. Making sure we have jobs is good. And he takes that to mean we're not polarized. And I said, okay, but my issue with that is that Fiorina's been saying this since 2008. He's been going, I have national surveys showing people are more interested in the economy and healthcare than gay rights or abortion since 2008. Okay. We've gone from 1/3 to 55% won't date. We've gone from under half to now over half won't marry. We had January 6th. I literally know people who will not talk to each other because they voted for Trump. So all that stuff, I guess, doesn't exist. I mean, because he's been saying, this 2008, he's still saying it now. He's still saying, I watched a speech from him last night. He's still saying it now, going, well, we have these surveys that show Americans are more interested in these, have more commonality on certain issues. Okay, I'm sure those surveys are showing that, but he's been saying since 2008, that means we're therefore not polarized. And that's why I asked you about the people being polarized. I know people who her dad won't talk to her anymore, ever, and then died on his deathbed without saying anything. That didn't happen 7 years before. Never heard of these stories before. I've had millions of these stories. And then we also have the dating and the marriage thing. And I go, something's not adding up here. I understand we have polls showing people are in agreement and it's not the people. And then we have real world life where they're not talking to each other. They're not integrating with each other. I've talked to a lot of professors who are from the Midwest, and they said absolutely when Trump came through town, and even though he's gone, it's not the same. People used to talk to each other, and now they don't at the neighborhood level. So I'm incredulous, I guess would be the right word, that we can take a data set of polls and go, well, we have these national polls that show majority of Americans are concerned about the same things. Therefore, they can't be polarized. That clearly can't be true.
Right. I agree with you. But polarization has many dimensions, I think. And what you're really asking is what's the most important thing here? Is it, and I have friends too who don't talk to anyone who's voted for Trump. In fact, I have friends who voted for Trump who I have to be very careful not to talk politics with,
right?
Because it's very hard for us
And
to
that's
talk
new,
politics.
right? It wasn't always like
That's
that.
new. Yeah, that's new.
Okay.
Yeah, although there's a question, Roosevelt had a number of people who were very, very, very opposed to him. Okay, but nonetheless,
We
it's
got to go
certainly new
back
in
close to a century.
close. Yes, I thought you'd say that because I thought of that immediately. You're right.
Because I've heard professors go, we've had more polarized times in American history. The silver versus gold debate, the riots against German immigrants, and I'm like, great, you got to go back 100 years to find something.
Right.
You have to go back before modern industrial super connected times to find an example like this. And my question is that really a good reference if you got to go back more than 10, 20 years, you're approaching a century? And is it also fair to say, well, they were polarized in 1870, 1930, and they got through it. Yeah, but they got through it with riots and with lots of people dead in the streets. And we are a billion times more urban and interconnected and living right on top of each other than they were in 1870 or 1930 or 1910. And the population's a billion times bigger. I got to imagine the death toll would be commensurately larger. And so I tell people, you're right. We survived the German riots and we survived the civil riots. And when you magnify the population of America at that time to now, we're talking about thousands to tens of thousands of people dead in the streets. People freaked out when 3,000 people died from a terrorist attack.
Right.
What happens when 10,000 Americans kill each other and it's live and televised and there's blood running in the streets? We get over that and go, we had a bad day. Come on, everybody, let's come back together again. Or is that the kind of thing that you never come back from?
Well, let me say you're correct that pulling historical analogies out from over a century ago is not as strong an argument as one would hope for. So I think that's well. I'll be more careful and never again mention anything from the 1930s.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Just
no. It's a very good point. It's a good point.
It's a pet peeve.
It's a strong point. It's a strong point and a good one. No, I do. I mean, it's a question of how you weight things. And I don't think anyone really knows how to weight these things. I mean, do you really weight things like a 3% unemployment rate as the really most important issue? Or is the most important issue, an abortion I mean, I know people who would argue that abortion is the central issue because it has to do with killing people. It is not it's not the perspective that I would take, but I do know people who are honestly believe that. Um,
Right.
and I don't think anyone has any good theories of what should happen. I mean, the Marxist theory is that the economy is most important. On the other hand, there are certainly theories that say that cultural issues are the central issues because they are part of people's identity.
I've heard
Um,
that.
and if you believe identity is really central, then that says the cultural issues are also central. Um, so you can sort of play your game whichever direction you want as far as pick the theory you like. Um, I don't think there's um, any consensus on this in the academic literature, and in fact, it's really hard to study in any systematic scientific way. Um, Kathy Kramer and some other people who've done similar things are probably as close to anyone, but that explains it. It explains why a particular version of resentment exists. It doesn't explain how it came about or what a good solution would look like, or even whether it's really central to people's lives. Um, you know, if there are plentiful jobs in rural areas, that will mean young people won't leave. It'll mean the population will stop declining.
Right.
One of the problems in those rural areas is there are not plentiful jobs. And, the slow declines of population, really this is part of, people see towns that they have lived in all their lives slowly deteriorating, and
Right.
they don't like that, you know. So,
Right. Right. I remember seeing a bill around 2014, and it was a Congress member saying, we need to invest in small towns across America
mhm,
to build them back up so that they can hold on to their populations. And nobody voted for it, and it got no support because they're like, hey, just move to the cities. What's the problem?
mhm, right,
Um,
mhm,
Now it makes sense. That would have been a
mhm,
great idea to do 15 years ago.
mhm.
Uh, I do have two sociology questions for you, specific
Okay.
sociology questions, the kind of
Mhm,
terminology questions. So, what is the term for when you have two groups and they're kind of in a binary system where there's only like yin and yang, A and B, and they tend to copy each other and base their identity on being the opposite of each other? For example, or
mhm.
does that already make sense?
That does make sense. I don't know that there's a term about this. I mean,
Okay.
it certainly is a standard part of conflict theory that
Okay.
two groups in conflict tend to define themselves in opposition to the other perspective. So this is I mean, pretty uncontroversial proposition, I think, but I don't
Thank
know of
you.
a term.
Thank you. I didn't know. I thought there was
Mhm,
okay. So what I've been noticing is when we look at polarization in America, there seems to be a pattern of we only have two political parties, right? We don't have a third. People, whatever they talk about. I'm not going to get into the debate. We have two, basically, always
mhm,
had two.
right.
Um, and when you have a closed system and there's
Mhm,
only two, there's no third example. They're obviously looking at each other.
mhm,
There's no other place to get examples from. And so we see one party do X, and then the next few years we see the other party do X. So,
mhm,
oh, you want to doubt that our guy got elected for 3 or 4 years? Well, we'll doubt that your guy got elected for 3 or 4 years.
mhm,
You want to launch a federal investigation of our candidate now that they're termed out of the presidency? Okay, well, next term, we're going to launch investigation on your guy or girl who's termed out of the presidency. And I seem to see this tit for tat where it's neither one is either aware of what they're doing. So the
mhm,
Democrats
right.
think they've never doubted an election ever. And the
Mhm,
Republicans think they've never doubted an election ever. But when I'm looking at the two of them in a timeline, they're clearly copying each other in a way to
mhm,
attack the other. If you
mhm,
punched me once, I played the stupid game with my brother where you lightly tap the person,
mhm,
and they lightly tap you. and then you hit them a little bit harder, and you're like, you hit me a little bit harder than I hit you. No, I didn't. And then eventually you're punching each other. It's a stupid
Mhm.
game. I played with
Mhm.
my brother, but is there something to that going on? It seems to be the Democrats and Republicans kind of have this. I'm a Republican, which means I'm not a sandal wearing hippie who doesn't bathe and can't hold a job. I'm a liberal, so therefore I'm not racist, and I've had an interracial relationship, and I believe in climate change. And there seem to be creating their identities as the opposite of the other.
Mhm.
Um, is that a theory in sociology? I think you're saying it is. Correct me if I'm
Part of
wrong.
it, yeah. I mean, it's a, as I said, I think it's a fairly uncontroversial proposition from conflict theory.
Okay.
That it's a component of conflict theory, where as your statement there on the screen says, two groups do tend to copy each other. I mean, the tendency is not 100%, so you can
Of course.
overstate it, but there's a sense in which the two groups try to uh, adopt good ideas from the other side, what seem to be good ideas or good approaches, only usually with a twist that reflects their own side.
So not controversial to maybe say that the
Mm.
Democrats and Republicans are in some sort of relationship with each other.
Oh yeah. Hmm.
Okay. Okay. Last big sociology question. This is something I've been asking people. I live in the Central Valley here in California. We
Hmm.
have and California is the biggest anti-war state in all of America. But the Central Valley in the middle of California has the highest contribution to all of America's foreign wars and the highest amount of kids coming back in body bags. I remember
Hmm.
that there was a high school near mine. They had the highest number of 18-year-olds coming back dead. So
Hmm.
Buchanan High School. I live in Fresno County.
In
Anyways,
Fresno. Hmm.
um, I remember with the Iraq War,
Hmm.
2005, 2008. My dad was in the Army during the Vietnam War, although he didn't go. He was around and he was in the military, lost a lot of friends. He liked going to the VA, the Veterans Affairs Hospital for veterans. He goes to the
Hmm.
hospital. And I remember around 2008, he'd come home and he'd go, well, I saw the new batch.
Hmm.
You know exactly what I'm talking about.
Hmm.
Okay, so he remembered people who would go to Vietnam and their body came back, but their mind never came back.
Hmm.
And he called it the 1,000-yard stare. And he was saying, I'm seeing the new crop of 20-year-olds with the same look on their face that I saw in the late 70s.
Hmm.
People are shattered and they never actually come back. Is it
Hmm.
possible for society to experience such a level of mass trauma that they become like some of the Iraq and Vietnam war vets who never actually come back?
Uh, the simple answer is I don't know of any reason to believe that. Society is not a person. Um, Society is a vastly more complex and more diverse entity, composed of lots of interlocking parts, some more tightly joined together than others. Um, I don't think that's generally true. I mean, if you look at situations where that resulted in a revolution, um, there are concrete material reasons for the revolution, economic, political, often military. A revolution often follows a military defeat, as it did, for example, in Russia in 1917. Um, this is a um, yeah, I would say no to that. I mean, the
Okay.
sources of societal unrest, shall we call it, that's a little bit too mild um, when you're talking about trauma here. But the sources of social unrest tend to be um, I mean, no, the defeat in war is one that certainly is a very big one historically. That's repeatedly led to governments changing. Even not even if the government changed by not even a change by force necessarily, um, but also very serious economic problems, economic collapse of some form or other, or just the economy turning very, very bad. Um, on the other hand, you have examples like Venezuela, where the economy has been disastrous now for decades, and Maduro has managed to hang on because he has control over the police and the military. Um, you don't, it's not necessarily, a lot of things have to, a lot of things interact in ways that we don't fully understand in a society. And I mean, a democratic society is not like Venezuela is or was. Um, the U.S. is very different. Um, the and the U.S. is huge. I mean, and the size of the U.S. means there's an inherent diversity that even beyond the simple meaning of racial diversity or religious diversity or something like that, it's just diversity of people's experiences in such a continent-wide nation. Um, this gives, I personally think this gives American politicians a big advantage in the world stage because they're used to dealing with diverse people and managing complicated interest groups that have contradictory points of view, and trying to reconcile those. I think smaller countries like Britain, you just don't have that level of conflict built into the
Mm,
system that you have in the
mm.
U.S.
Because there's so
So
many different people.
there's so many different people and so many different experiences that they have. You grow up in Montana, that's very different than growing up in the Central Valley. But the Central Valley is probably very different than Los Angeles.
It is, although we have common California characteristics, as I like to say.
Yeah, right.
Well, for example, we've had a Japanese community in Fresno for a century,
Right.
and a Chinese community in Filipino. And I go talk to my friends in Nevada and Kentucky. They don't have anything like that. It's like maybe like the 1990s peoples that were like, well, we didn't do it in a century, even in our backwater conservative parts. Fair enough. I would point out a couple things. Some historians have said that around, I think, 1968, 1969, that the African American community of America entered a period of permanent trauma after the assassination of Martin Luther King and John Fitzgerald Kennedy. They basically believed that the system wouldn't ever change for them, and they receded into themselves as a community. Not my opinion, what sociological historians have said. We also have the indigenous schools. There was a period of about 20 to 70 years where they forced indigenous in Canada and America into schools. The indigenous are still traumatized by even the pictures of school pencils today. We also have the South, and although they should not have fought the war in the Confederacy in 1860, they did. I have relatives in the South. They still talk about the trauma of losing. I've gone to groups where people are still crying, and what they're talking about is Sherman's March through the sea, permanently traumatized. We also have the Irish, and the Irish were peacefully protesting in the 70s until an event called Bloody Sunday, where the British came in and just mowed down a bunch of them right in front of the thing. And that was so traumatizing that the Irish stopped peacefully protesting and started the Irish Republican Army for the next 20 to 30 years. These are examples of something really bad happens, and they don't let it go for decades or generations. Could we call these examples of, generational trauma, or perhaps a point of too much trauma?
You could certainly call them examples of trauma. I guess what I would say is some people feel them more than others. While I too have encountered people who are still fighting Sherman, and this is not my grandmother used to divide people into what side they were on the Civil War, and she was born in, I think, 1890. something like that. So this. I mean, these memories continue. Um, Whether everyone is traumatized, I don't know. I mean, in your Irish case, you have the Good Friday Accords that resulted in a peaceful Ireland for the rest of the you know since 1998.
Sure.
Um, you have, in the case of the U.S., you have, the enormously prosperous 1990s and 2000s. Um, so even for African Americans, for most African Americans, these were very prosperous times. Notwithstanding, issues of unemployment and racial discrimination and so on. The forced schooling is a really bad one. Canada is only now coming to grips with that. Um, and yeah, I mean, how that will work itself out, I don't know. I mean, you could easily have also picked the indigenous people in Australia and some
Right.
of the issues related there,
Right.
which are similar, somewhat, not quite identical, but similar to the Canadian issues and to some of the ways that the U.S. has treated its own Native American population.
Right. Right. You're
Um,
right. You're right. You're right.
so, but I don't think, you know, these are signal events. Um, whether they're, it's, I find it hard to see them as historical turning points. Um, the possible exception there being the Irish Bloody Sunday, because as you say, this really was a big shot in the arm for the IRA and for its campaign against the British. Um, and it took decades for that to die down.
Right.
The troubles continued until the Good Friday Accords. Sherman's March to the Sea was a consequence of the Civil War, and the point was bringing the war home to a population that had basically been untouched.
Sure.
And
Sure.
what it's people, they were shocked at
I,
what it meant.
I'm just saying
So,
it looks like there's times in history, and you're right. The 1990s was very prosperous for African Americans. Bill Clinton was president. They were coming up.
mhm,
There was the Good Friday Accords in Ireland, but there was also a 2 to 3 decade period where people were shocked and kind of unto themselves until I think they started coming out, like Clinton in the
mhm,
90s saying, I want a cabinet that represents America, or the Good Friday Accords. If we look at it that way, and I'm not excusing the South doing what they did in the Confederacy, but I am saying that Sherman went through and burned homes and trashed homes, and there was a lot of women who were victimized. I understand that's debatable in the North, but I've seen some of the memoirs of what happened. They still talk about it today. Like they're
yeah.
not over it a century and a half ago. So I'm wondering about, is there a level of trauma where maybe it lasts 80 years, maybe it only lasts 30 years?
hmm There certainly is an issue here. I mean, if you think about American politics, between 1960 and 1980, we had only one-term presidents. I think everyone was a one-term president in that 20-year period. Now, starting in 1980, we had a set of two-term presidents until Trump in 2020. Um, so you do have varying degrees of stability here, which and certainly the U.S. was
Okay, great.
probably less stable.
Yeah, there you go. You're back. Okay.
Oh, okay, yeah, you froze for a moment too.
We'll wrap it up. The internet
Okay,
gods are upset. We'll wrap it up. I really appreciate your participation. Let me ask you the last two questions, if I may.
sure.
Um,
Okay, you're frozen again.
uh, we'll end the show
Ah,
here. I'm not. We're having internet
yeah, right,
disruption,
yeah,
so let's just
clearly.
end it here while we're good. I really
Okay,
appreciate your time, and I want to say thank you.
you're very welcome. So can I ask, what's the next step in this? Are you going to edit this for highlights, or what happens at this point?
I will send you a copy of the interview. It's on my personal channel.
Hmm.
I'm trying to interview as many people as possible, and eventually I do want to write a book, but I first want to
Hmm.
understand the problem first. I've
Hmm.
been doing a lot of reading, um,
Oh,
and
wow. Okay.
I've interviewed about 80 professors. I'm trying to get
Hmm.
the whole, collect them all. I've
Hmm.
literally looked up every single study on political polarizations from 1980 to 2022, and I've
Hmm.
attempted to contact everybody. A lot of people,
Wow.
I couldn't, but some people do. So I want to be the definitive place that has. I can't compete on the academic level. People have higher pedigrees, but I thought I could compete on the data level if I did more
Hmm.
interviews and had read more and had more conclusions.
Hmm.
Also, I got into a conversation with a professor the other day. The other problem is that a lot of professors are trained to be myopic, focus
Right.
on a specific thing, which is what makes them awesome.
Hmm.
But the study, we need generalizing. We need
Hmm.
generalists. Like you said, political polarization, how are you going to fix it? It's not going to be one factor. It's going to be like 15
Right.
factors
Hmm.
over
Hmm.
time in a plan. That requires generalization, and it's a little bit outside of the wheelhouse I found of academic researchers who,
Right.
because of their practice, have to focus.
Right.
And I thought I
Yeah.
might be able to provide a summary or synthesis book, the state, where we are with what we know
Hmm.
in
Yeah.
general, for dummies, kind of written for the public,
Sure.
but with academics in it.
Yeah, let me suggest, if you're interested in the research, there are two things that I would suggest. Are you familiar with the Haidt and Bale bibliography on political polarization?
No, I need to get that. Hate and B. How do you spell that?
Haidt. It's Jonathan Haidt and Chris Bale,
Okay,
Bail. They did a biography that's a Google Doc, so you can look at it and download it freely, of everything that is known about social media in general, among which is the political polarization issue. And the last time I looked at it, it was 165 pages long
okay,
of biographical
perfect.
entries. So it's online. If you can't find it, email me and I can find it and send you the URL. Um, the second thing is, do you know Kennedy's book on, what's it called? It's something like how empires fail or how countries fail, something like that. I don't, do I have, let me see if I have the reference. It's the same Kennedy who wrote Engineers of Victory and several other things. Um, why can't I? Let me just look and see if I have it here.
I've certainly heard of hate, and I've
Yeah,
yeah,
Jonathan Haidt and Chris Bale is
yeah,
at Duke.
yeah. I've
Um,
I've read some of their stuff. I didn't know they had this reserve
mhm,
information. That's awesome. How
right.
Empires Fail, also by the author of Engines of Victory,
That's
whose
right.
last name is Kennedy.
Yeah. Um, if you can't find it, I'm sorry I can't put my hands on it real quickly off the top of my head here. But if you can't find it, email me and I'll send you an exact reference. Um,
Perfect, perfect. Uh, do you have any recommendations? Is there anybody you know who might be willing to be part of an honest conversation? Don't have to. We just don't. Some
yeah,
movies do.
who does this sort of thing? Ralph Schroeder here at the OII would be the only other person at the OII would have who might be who was doing stuff on this. And do you know Peter Turchin's books?
I've heard the name.
Yeah, Turchin. He
Yeah.
has a theory of basically social unrest, and sort of he has a mathematical theory of social change broadly. He's written 3 books on it, and he's yeah. I mean, I'm kind of a little sort of yes, but it's interesting set of insights, but a little too deterministic for me.
Okay.
Um,
All right.
I mean, I while I don't believe in the great man theory by any means, I'm a sociologist after all, and we believe in structure with a capital S.
Right.
Nonetheless, when you look at history, it's hard to escape the conclusion that at various points in time, having a particular person in a particular difference made a difference. In a particular
Yeah.
setting made a difference. You know, Harry Truman instead of Henry Wallace as vice president in 1945, for example,
Yeah.
or Churchill as prime minister rather than someone else.
Right.
You know,
Right.
or just to pick two examples from that particular period. Lenin in 1917, you know, if the Germans hadn't sent him from Switzerland to across to St. Petersburg, it's hard to believe the Russian Revolution would have occurred.
Fair enough.
Um,
Fair enough.
so there are similar things. I mean, if the U.S. had not elected Lincoln in 1860, who on earth could have been held the Union together?
Fair enough. Fair enough.
So,
Yeah,
but
there's a lot
you
of
know,
great man theory in history. It's hard to avoid.
it is hard to avoid. Although, as I say, as a sociologist, I am firmly committed to structure.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Okay.
Let me ask you the last question. We always ask people. This is designed to stump you.
Okay.
So I'm telling you ahead of time it's going to happen. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third-party person who's going to watch this video. And they're going to say, wow, a lot of great information. I learned a lot, but I had trouble remembering it all. But there was this one thing that the professor said, and boy, it's 5 days later, and I still can't stop thinking about this one thing the professor said. What is that one thing you want a random person you've never met before to not be able to stop thinking about 5 days from now?
Okay. All right. I guess the simplest answer from my point of view is the empirical sort of data that we started with from that paper, because that's the safest thing that is less my opinion and more, I think, factually based. That when you look at the media ecosystem as a whole, most people get lots of information from lots of different places, and they certainly do not. Their political information diet is varied for most people. So that would be, you have to look at the whole ecosystem. You can't just focus on social media or television. I mean, 40 years ago, there were all these theories of television and how television was its role. And now it's all social media. So that would be the thing I would prefer that they remember. Whether that's what they actually remember, I don't know.
Well, we'll find out. Before we get another interrupt break, I'm going to thank the internet gods and say thank you. Thank you, Professor, for coming out. Thank you for answering all my questions. Thank you for being part of a creative conversation and taking the time to educate me and the public. I will email you shortly a copy of the video, and I really appreciate your time.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it. And have a great day then.
Okay. I hope you enjoy some cheery English weather.
It's sunny today, of all things.
Oh, that is not typical.
It is definitely not typical. Nope. So
definitely
anyway,
get outside. Okay.
I will. Okay. Bye now.